Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 3 lecture. In Chapter 3, we're going to be looking at the causes of delinquency, specifically looking at the different theories of crime, past and present, as well as integrated theories. I know this chapter can be a little dry and a little boring, but there's a lot of different theories in here. There's a lot of good theories, and this is going to specifically relate to your midterm presentations. So please make sure that you pay attention here. All right, so let's get into your Chapter 3 lecture. The learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to summarize the principles and influences of the classical school of criminology. Describe biological theories of juvenile crime and delinquency. Describe psychological theories of juvenile crime and delinquency. Describe sociological theories. Explain why delinquency across life course is important in studying theories of crime, as well as summarize integrated theories. So, your book opens by discussing how researchers at Shippensburg University actually argued that unpopular names are associated with delinquency. Not that the names are a direct result of crime, or that crime is a direct result of having an unpopular name, but that it's correlated with a socioeconomic status that shows an increase in delinquency, specifically those with disadvantaged home environments, those that come from low-income families, where your place of residence is, and the acquisition of cultural values that support delinquency. It was an interesting take on delinquency and the cause of delinquency, so let's get into some other thoughts of criminology. So let's start with the classical school. So the classical school argues that humans as rational beings are willing to give up certain liberties to the state so that society can establish rules and sanctions that preserve public order. That individuals have free will, and they also argue equal justice for all. Cesar Beccaria wrote On Crimes and Punishment in 1763 and said that the legitimacy of criminal sanctions is essentially equal to a social contract. That punishment should deter crime, as in it should be public, immediate, and that punishment is necessary. Punishment should be certain and swift, but it should also be proportionate to the crime. Remember, equal justice for all. Then we have Jeremy Bentham, who in 1780 wrote An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. So Bentham said that a rational person will do whatever is necessary to achieve maximum pleasure and minimum pain. It's considered or known as a falsific calculus. So there are 4 objectives to punishment that he states. First is that punishment should prevent all offenses. That punishment should convince a person who intends to commit a crime to commit a less serious offense than they intended, to convince a person to do no further criminal action than is necessary for their current purpose, as well as to prevent crime at the smallest possible cost to society. So delinquency should be punished because they deserve it. Delinquents should be punished because they are rational thinking and they have free will. However, you will learn, if you don't know already, that youth are not rational thinkers. They are far from it. So rational choice theory is similar to the classical school. It assumes that a juvenile is going to weigh the costs and benefits, again, that they have free will to commit crimes or not to commit crimes. So routine activity approach came out of a result of the changes in routine activities of society since about 1960. They found that there was an increase in target suitability, as well as a decrease in the presence of guardians or community members who would look out for one another. So it's interesting that the research shows that those who go out more often are more likely to be victims of a stranger, while those who stay in are more likely to be victims of someone that they know. This theory believes there is a high degree of rationality not seen in youthful offenders. And that delinquency is part of a problem-solving process so that offenders get a short-term pleasure out of delinquent behaviors, but it's them just trying to figure out their world. That youth will naturally desist from crime because offending eventually will not align with holding a job or starting a family. And that delinquency is not planned. It is in fact very, very spurious. So for an event to be planned, first someone needs to formulate a scheme and have the intent to act upon that scheme. They then need to assess the alternatives, choose a course that they're going to take, and construct a method to achieve that intended result. Youth are not capable of thinking through, most youth are not capable of thinking through all of these steps here to make a very planned decision. So they say that biological, psychological, and social factors are going to affect one's freedom of choice. It's not just as simple as everyone has free choice and is born with it. So how do we justify punishing delinquents? How do we justify punishing offenders? Well, there are a few justifications. One is that it provides beneficial consequences to that offender. So it's going to protect the public, it's going to prevent disorder, and is going to reduce social harm. So by punishing the offender, society is receiving benefits. We argue that punishment is deserved, just desserts. You do the crime, you do the time. Punishment in and of itself expresses public outrage for criminal offending behaviors. So by punishing an offender, society is saying that this is unacceptable and this is not okay. And then it also teaches a lesson, hopefully, teaches the offender that they should not want to commit crimes again. Again, deterring them from committing crimes. And that it helps maintain government, social structure, and a society. So the thought here is that the state can't survive without a set of rules that creates, supports, and protects its structures and functions. So the structures and functions of the state, in order to have that, we need rules. However, these rules being formalized into laws is what controls behavior that threatens state security and the well-being of others. So what is our goal for punishing offenders? First is general deterrence. This is aimed at the public, not individuals. So we hope that by having punishments in place, we can deter anyone from committing a crime because they're not going to want to experience that punishment. Specific deterrence is the opposite. So this is aimed at an individual offender. So we hope that by punishing an offender and them experiencing this punishment, that they're not going to want to commit another crime because they don't want to experience that same punishment or worse punishment. We then have the goal of incapacitation. So sometimes offenders need to be removed from the community and society for the safety of others and sometimes of themselves. Rehabilitation. We have a goal of treatment, especially in the juvenile system. We're built on the goal of rehabilitation, treating offenders, giving them services, and improving their life outcomes. This idea of just desserts or retribution. So punishment is deserved when you commit an offense. In addition to restoration, so having reintegration of the offender back into society by helping them make amends and repair harm that they've caused, whether that harm is to the victim or to society. And then this idea of equity or restitution, which boils down to fair and impartial treatment. So let's jump into the history of positivism. So in positivism, we view human behavior as just one part of the natural order. So here poverty is seen as a major cause of delinquency. So laws govern human behavior, and once they're understood, then we can modify those so that we can either get rid of society's problems or we can make them better. There are three assumptions, though, that positivism makes. One is that character and personal background can explain delinquent behavior. That delinquency is determined by prior causes, So it rejects the idea that people have freedom of choice and that delinquents are fundamentally different than non-delinquents. So looking at the biological side of this, Cesare Lombroso is considered the father of criminology. So he founded biological positivism and believed that people were simply born criminals. We're looking at just the biology here. Henry Goddard then looked at genealogy and found that over 50% of juvenile delinquents had a mental deficit. And then Ernst Kretschmer, who had this body type theory, so he found that there were two types of physical bodies that an individual could have. It was either a schizotype, which is a strong and muscular body type, or a cyclotype, which is a soft-skinned or lacked muscle. The first one, he believed, was the body type of a criminal. So how do we put positivism, or how do we view positivism today? Well, we look at sociobiology, which links genetics and environmental factors. So we say that criminal behavior can't just be explained through biology, but it also can't simply be explained through social aspects either. So we need to look at neuropsychological factors when we're assessing delinquency. We also need to look at the relationship between one's temperament and negative behaviors. So temperament is identified by activities or emotionality. So an activity are things such as motor movements, the actual behaviors or activities that one is engaging in. And then emotionality are the emotional reactions that a person has. So you need to look at both of these to explain one's temperament, and that temperament can be related to negative behavior. So when we look at hyperactivity, a lot of youth are hyperactive, especially ones that find themselves in the juvenile justice system. So a hyperactive child has 3 common behaviors, being impulsivity, inattention, and excessive motor activity. So now let's get into the psychoanalytic theory. So Sigmund Freud is the founder of psychoanalytic theory, and it's based on a biological determinist view. So he first said that children who can't control the id or their inner self, they cannot distinguish socially acceptable from unacceptable behaviors. This theory believes that children must learn to control their sexual and aggressive drives, which creates inner tension that they must learn to resolve in a positive way. And finally, that emotional experiences before the age of 5 can actually affect a child lifelong. So as we continue thinking about behaviors and emotionality and how that affects delinquency, we're going to look at optimal arousal theory. So this looks at the idea of sensation-seeking behaviors causing delinquency. So those who are sensation-seeking are an individual who needs to have varied, new, and complex sensations or experiences, and those individuals are willing to take physical and social risks in order to achieve an optimal level of arousal. So Jack Katz wrote Seductions of Crime, where he argued that offenders engage in an emotional process of seductions and compulsions, that crimes are centrally compelling to an offender because of their immediate social environment as well as the experiences they've had. We then look at the psychopath, which is someone who has a conduct disorder where they lack affect, they have an inability to empathize with others, and they commit crimes in a cold-hearted or unemotional manner. So along those lines, Robert D. Hare describes the antisocial personality, which the antisocial personality is a conduct disorder, and he identifies a checklist of sorts. So a few of those attributes included in his checklist are that this person is cunning or manipulative, that they lack remorse or empathy, they can be callous and impulsive, and they just don't have concern for others. Lee and Robbins then said that the continuity between childhood emotional problems and that there was a continuity, between childhood emotional problems and adult psychopathic behaviors. So he found that over 50% of adult male sociopaths had an onset of symptoms before the age of 8. So that they displayed these antisocial personality traits that Robert D. Hare described before the age of 8. And then we look at reinforcement theory, where we look at rewards of a crime. Rewards of a crime are the material gains or the immediate gains that a person receives. And consequences, which are things such as the disapproval of peers, being punished, revenge from the victim. However, some of these take longer to see. So this theory says that behavior is governed by these consequences and rewards as well as punishments that are reflected in the history of individuals. Now we'll take a look at sociological theories. So sociological positivism says that overall, crimes require addressing social reform rather than just the individual. So social reform being social and cultural conditions, not just addressing the person. Social structure theories, there are 3. We have social structure, social disorganization, cultural deviance, and status frustration or strain theory. So these social structure theories argue that crime is a result of all 3 of these. So social disorganization says that crime is a result of a breakdown of social control by the family and neighborhood, specifically because of social disorganization of that community. Things like deteriorated buildings, high school truancy, and high infant mortality rates. And that theory is by Shaw and McKay. Cultural deviance, then, by Walter B. Miller, says that the lower class has its own cultural history, that motivation to engage in criminal behavior is intrinsic in the lower class cultures. So he identifies focal concerns. There are 6 of them. The first is trouble, that the lower class has a preoccupation with getting into trouble. Looks at toughness, that being a good fighter is the ideal personality in lower class cultures. Smartness, but in the way of outsmarting others and being cunning, is valued. Excitement, but excitement through the widespread use of alcohol and drugs. Number 5, he looks at fate, but fate in the way that their life is already decided for them, speaking of those in the lower class, that they have no control over the outcome of their life. And that's why they engage in delinquency, because they don't feel that they have control anyway. And autonomy, that they do have a desire for personal independence, but that is very hard to find that. And then we look at status frustration, also known as strain theory. So Robert K. Merton said that the cultural goals and means to achieve those goals must be reasonably related if a culture is going to remain stable. So when people don't have a legitimate means to achieve goals of that culture or society, then they turn towards criminality in order to find a way to achieve those goals. So speaking of having opportunities and finding ways to achieve those statuses, we look at opportunity theory. So opportunity theory believes that lower class cultures are asked to behave in such a way that they will be able to accumulate wealth, just as middle and upper class are able to. However, they're denied a legitimate means to obtain that wealth. So delinquent subcultures develop specifically in response to that blocked opportunity, or that inability to have an opportunity to achieve that wealth. So you'll see here we have the American dream plus common socialization among community members. That leads into blocked opportunities. They then have a sense of feel a sense of injustice. And then you look at the neighborhood organization. Is it a criminal organization in that neighborhood? We then have delinquent or criminal subcultures that come out of that as a result because they're trying to pursue economic success, and that's the only means by which they have to pursue that success. So speaking of delinquent subcultures, Albert Cohen said that destructive and malicious behavior of lower class delinquent subcultures is a reaction to not being able to achieve those middle class norms. So similarly, we tell an individual, have the American dream, obtain success, but then we add that with lower class socialization, so socializing with those in the lower class, and then placing those youth in middle class institutions, such as schools. They feel a failure to measure up, so now they're frustrated. They have a loss of self-esteem. So they form reactions, and those reactions are unfortunately malicious, negative, and delinquent. So let's talk a little bit more about the social process and how that causes delinquency. So social process theories examine interactions between people and their environment that is going to influence an individual to become involved in criminal or delinquent behaviors. So differential association by Sutherland says that crime is learned from others as a product of social interaction. Looking at containment theory, you have internal control and external control systems. So Walter Reckless said that when you combine that you have internal control, which is things like self-control, high frustration tolerance, and when you combine that with external control systems such as buffers in their immediate environment, that interacts to produce crime. And then social control. So delinquent behavior, Hershey said, is linked to the bond a person has with their social groups. So the stronger the elements, the bond, the less likely that individual is going to engage in delinquent behaviors. So they need to have attachment to conventional others, a commitment to conventional activities and values, involvement in those conventional activities, as well as a belief and respect for the law and social norms. Finally, we discussed labeling theory. So labeling theory is where it's believed that society actually creates deviants by labeling them as such. So by labeling someone a criminal, labeling them a delinquent, we ostracize them from regular society because we're setting them aside as separate by giving them these labels. So this is done via formal and informal reactions to others' deviance. We have primary deviance, which is the behavior of the individual, and secondary deviation, which is the behavior of the individual as a direct result of society's reaction to that behavior. So let's take a look at conflict theories. So conflict theories, there are three main ones that your book discusses, being the Marxist criminology, power, and group or cultural conflict. So in the Marxist view, it views the state and law as the ultimate tools of economic interest of the ownership class. So saying that capitalism, not human nature, creates crime. So everyone trying to obtain wealth. We then look at power and authority relationships. So in this view, power is viewed as being a critical variable that explains crime. Essentially, people are trying to obtain power, and sometimes in order to obtain that power and to obtain authority over others, they need to engage in criminal behavior. And then group or cultural conflict theory, which views the process of lawmaking, breaking, and enforcement reflecting fundamental conflicts between interest groups and the more general struggles for control of police power of the state. So taking all of those theories together, let's look at how they could be integrated together. So looking at integrated theories of crime. You first have general theory of crime, which is a lack of self-control, which says that a lack of self-control is a common factor underlying problem behaviors. That self-control is the degree to which an individual is vulnerable to temptations of the moment, and that crime opportunity is a function of structural and situational circumstances. Integrated social process theory says that living in socially disorganized areas can lead youth to develop weak bonds to conventional groups, activities, and norms. So essentially having high levels of strain and adding to that weak social bonds leads youth to seek out delinquent peers. And finally, we look at interactional theory. So this theory says that delinquency arises from weakening bonds to conventional society. So conventional society being family, school, and values. So essentially having an association with delinquent peers and combining that with delinquent values leads to prolonged serious delinquency. And this just continues in cycles across the life course of that individual. So speaking of delinquency across the life course, looking at the life course perspective, we look at turning points and trajectories. So turning points are the gradual or dramatic changes that can lead one to transition from one state to another. The trajectory then is the path that the individual is placed on as a result of that turning point. So longitudinal studies show that male criminal careers begin earlier and actually extend longer than female crime careers do. That conventional life patterns, including marriage, parenting, and work, can actually draw individuals away from gangs and offending behaviors. And that specifically when we look at desistance of crime in women, we see quality marriages helping them desist from crime, that a cognitive shift or transformation occurs in these women where they realize that the goals they have for their life aren't aligning with their criminal careers. And then specifically inner city women of color said that being involved in alcohol or drug treatment, as well as simply being tired of being repeatedly imprisoned, helped them desist from crime. So all of these different theories help us form social policy. So looking at the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods, which began in the mid-1990s, and this was by Felton Earls, this was an interdisciplinary study of how families, schools, and neighborhoods affect child and adolescent development. So they had a longitudinal study where they interviewed 6,000 youth and caregivers, as well as conducted a neighborhood study of 9,000 residents and did systematic observations of 80 neighborhoods. What they found is that the neighborhood social processes had a significant impact on community homicide and violence. So we have collective efficacy, that homicide and violent victimization rates were actually lower when the community shared values, when they had common expectations of their community members' behavior, and when they trusted one another. And then the Los Angeles Family and Neighborhood Study. This began in 2000 and it's ongoing. So 3,000 families were surveyed in 65 Los Angeles neighborhoods. The question they were looking to answer is what makes a neighborhood a positive place to live? There's been a few publications that have come out from this survey, but one of the findings that your book mentions is that members of racial ethnic groups appear to exhibit negative health risk behaviors when they reside in areas that are disproportionately populated with co-ethnic peers. So, I know that was a lot. It was a lot of different theories and we went sort of quick. There's really no good way to explain those other than just going down them. But I hope hearing it rather than simply just reading it out of the text was helpful for you. So in sum, classical schools believe that individuals have free will and that people choose whether or not they're going to commit crimes. Biological theories believe that people were born criminal. Today, Sociobiological theories take into account both biology as well as the environment to explain crime. Psychological theories address psychopathic factors, sensation seeking, as well as delinquency and reinforcement as contributing factors to delinquency. Sociobiological theories include structural and social process. And the DLC aims to document and explain, or delinquency across the life course, aims to document and explain within individual changes in offending throughout their life, showing that crime is in fact connected to childhood behavior. And finally, integrated theories draw on strain theory to generate an integrated one that captures a larger number of delinquent behaviors. So that was your Chapter 3 lesson. There will be a PDF posted that you can follow along with as you listen.